Hi and welcome to How and Why, and for this video we're going to look at eruv and how it helps circumvent the laws of carrying on Shabbos. Carrying on Shabbos is prohibited because it's one of the 39 activities that were involved in the construction of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, which is what the children of Israel built when they were in the wilderness. They would have to load and unload wood from wagons. But there's an important detail that adds a whole new dimension to the restriction. We know we're allowed to carry within our own homes on Shabbos. We're allowed to carry from one room to another. We're allowed to carry within shul. And at home, if we've got a continuous boundary around our houses, you're allowed to carry from your home out into the garden. If you've got a continuous boundary around you and your neighbour's gardens, you can carry from one garden to the next, which is kind of useful if you drop a football over their fence. I should point out that whilst an eruv does allow carrying on Shabbos, it doesn't allow carrying of items that are considered muksa. It doesn't override the laws of muksa. So, for example, we have here things designated for a mitzvah, so they're muksa. We have electronic items, matches, coins, they're all muksa, tools, pens. We still wouldn't be able to carry those within an eruv. To understand this better, we need to go back to the original scenario in the desert of the wood and the wagons. The problem wasn't moving the wood around within the wagons. The problem was offloading the wood from the wagons into the desert. That's because the wagons constituted a private domain, what we've called in Hebrew a reshus hayochid, just like your house or the shul or any of the other buildings that we've mentioned. Whereas the desert is a public domain, what we call a reshus harabim. So the prohibition now becomes transferring from a private domain to a public domain, from a reshus hayochid to a reshus harabim, or indeed carrying within a reshus harabim, within a public domain. So the question now becomes, well, what is it that constitutes a reshus hayochid, a private domain, and what is it that constitutes a reshus harabim, a public domain? We extrapolate from the wagons what the definition of a private domain is. A private domain is an area that is 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths in area, and has a perimeter as a wall around it that is 10 handbreadths high. If we take a handbreadth to be roughly 9.1 to 9.65 centimetres, then 4 handbreadths is about 38.6 centimetres, and 10 handbreadths, the minimum height for the mechitza, for the wall, is just about under a metre. As we can see, this phone booth here would easily qualify to be a reshus hayochid, a private domain. However, the definition of a reshus harabim, on the other hand, is a lot less straightforward. In fact, it's the subject of one of the greatest halachic debates we've had in the whole of Jewish history, with major rabbinic figures lining up on either side to give their point of view. It all starts off fairly straightforwardly. There's a Rashi commenting on the Gemara of Eruvin, that's the tractate of Talmud that deals with the laws of eruv. And on page 59, he defines a reshus harabim based on the original scenario of the wagons in the desert. And just as we're told that in the desert there were 600,000 of the children of Israel travelling through it, so too Rashi says that for an area to constitute a reshus harabim, it has to have 600,000 people travelling through it at any one period of time. What he calls shishim ribo, 600,000 people. The Shulchan Aruch, which is the definitive arbiter of Jewish law, uses Rashi's definition to define a reshus harabim. And in section 345, section 7, he, sure enough, defines reshus harabim according to the opinion of shishim ribo, 600,000 people. The only problem is that he also gives a dissenting opinion based on a separate section of Talmud in Bava Basra that deals with property rights. And there, in chapter 6, there's a Mishnah that defines a reshus harabim, a public domain, as being 16 cubits wide. Now a cubit, or an amma in Hebrew, is about 6 handbreadths, 6 tefachim.
which relates roughly to about 58 centimetres. So 16 cubits is only 928 centimetres wide. That's not a lot.
So if we stick with Rashi's definition of a Rishus Harabim, that of Shishim Ribo of 600,000 people going through it at any one time, then there's very few places that are actually a Rishus Harabim. Brent Cross wouldn't be a Rishus Harabim. Even Wembley Stadium, top notch, gets about 80,000, 90,000 people in it. So that sets the bar quite high. There are very few places that would be halakhically a Rishus Harabim.
Now I know what you're thinking, this is just a bunch of rabbis arguing about what rabbis usually argue about. What has it got to do with eruv? Well, the truth is it's got everything to do with eruv. That's because the area within which you want your eruv to encompass, halakhically speaking, mustn't include a Rishus Harabim, unless under very specific circumstances that are very difficult to fulfill. And on that, everyone agrees.
So just to recap, so far we have two domains. We have a private domain and a public domain. A Rishus HaYochid and a Rishus HaRabim. And whilst we can carry within a Rishus HaYochid, a private domain, or between adjoining private domains, we cannot carry from a private domain into a public domain. And we also cannot carry within a public domain. But most areas don't fall into either one of those two categories. They are classified as a third domain, which is called a Carmelis.
A Carmelis has some of the characteristics of a private domain and some of the characteristics of a public domain. You can't carry from a Rishus HaYochid, a private domain like your house or a shul, out into a Carmelis. You can't carry within a Carmelis, just like a Rishus HaRabim. But, unlike a Rishus HaRabim, having a Carmelis within the perimeter of your eruv doesn't invalidate the eruv, which is good news because there's so many of them about.
So we've got our three domains. We've got a Rishus HaYochid, a Rishus HaRabim, and a Carmelis. There is a fourth type of domain, which is unused land, like a lake or a swamp or marshland or whatever it is. Any land that can't be accessed by humans, we don't include in an eruv.
But wouldn't it be great if we had some way of merging all of these Rishus HaYochid, all these private domains and these Carmelises into one big Rishus HaYochid? If it was a Rishus HaYochid, then we could carry freely anywhere we liked. Let's look back at our definition of what a Rishus HaYochid is. It's got to be 4 by 4 handbreadths and have that 10 handbreadth high perimeter around it.
But hang on, we said that a house is a Rishus HaYochid. Well, I don't know about your house, but our house has doors and windows in it. We use them to get in and out of the house. Well, maybe not the windows. Don't those gaps represent a breach in the walls of our Rishus HaYochid?
But fences have gaps in them. Does that invalidate them as a boundary, as a mechitza for our Rishus HaYochid? Well, obviously it doesn't. But how big a gap can you have before it does become a problem?
The answer comes from a rather unexpected source, somewhere else in the Mishnah, where we learn about walls as well. That's right, our sukkah. A sukkah has many of the characteristics of a Rishus HaYochid. It has to have walls, and those walls have to be 10 tefachim high. Remember, we said that a tefach is 9.6 centimetres, that's 96 millimetres high. So 10 tefachim would be just under a metre. In fact, the first Mishnah in the Masechta of Sukkah is structured in pretty much the same way that the first Mishnah is in the Masechta of Eruvin that deals with eruvs, to show that there's a lot of overlap between the two. But there's an important principle in the laws of Sukkah that we can learn and derive and apply to an eruv. And that principle is loved. Loved is the principle that if you have a gap that is no more than 3 tefachim wide, then that gap can be overlooked.
and it's counted as a continuous wall on either side of the gap. Now remember we said 3 tefachim, 1 tefach is 9.6 centimetres, so 3 tefachim would be just under the length of this ruler. So if we have a gap in the walls of our sukkah, or in the walls of our eruv, that is no more than 3 times 96 millimeters wide, then we can ignore that gap and count it as a continuous boundary, be that part of a fence or a gap between 2 walls.
So as long as the boundary of our eruv is made up of walls or fences or backs of houses, fronts of houses, and those boundaries are at least a metre 10 tefachim high, and there's no gaps in them that are more than 3 tefachim, that we said that was 3 handbreadths, about 26-29 centimetres wide, then we're okay. In fact, the more of these natural boundaries there are, the better. The problem arises when you come to the end of a row of houses and the perimeter of your eruv wants to jump over a road like this. What do you do then? Back to our Rosh Hashanah, our house. As we've said, it's got doorways in it that let us go in and out of the house. Well, wouldn't it be great if we could somehow mimic those doorways, halachically, and incorporate them into the perimeter of our eruv to enable us to go in and out of the perimeter of the eruv? And that's what we're doing right here. Go on.
Halachically, a doorway consists of 3 things. You have 2 vertical doorposts, which are each called a lechi, and a horizontal lintel that goes across the top, called a korah. And of course you've got the door. But what if you take away the door? Does that still constitute a halachically valid doorway? The answer is, well, it kind of does. It's what we call a tzuras haPesach, which means the likeness of a doorway. And crucially for us, a tzuras haPesach still constitutes a valid boundary as part of the perimeter of our eruv. So if we look at these engineering drawings for our eruv application, you can see the 2 lechim, the 2 vertical posts, and the wire going across the top, which is the korah.
So an eruv works by making the whole area within it one big fat Rosh Hashanah, private domain. And just like within your house you can carry, so within the perimeter of an eruv you can carry.
To see how this works in practice, let's have a look at the plan view of a hypothetical eruv. The thick black line represents the perimeter of the eruv, with a tzuras haPesach at the top and bottom of the road to bridge the gaps in the boundary. The blue rectangle represents the area inside the eruv. Those red squares with green rectangles on either sides are rows of houses, with a garden at the front and back. Now, for the row of houses on the left, the boundary follows the backs of the gardens of the houses. So, one would be unable to carry from the back garden out into the outside of the other side of their fence, outside of the eruv, which in most cases is pretty much okay. And we tend to prefer to use the rears of houses for the purposes of a natural existing boundary of an eruv. But for those on the right-hand side, the perimeter follows the fronts of the houses. And for those people, that presents a problem, because they're unable to carry out of their house, because the minute they leave their front door, they're outside the boundary of the eruv. And that's a scenario we try and avoid at all costs if we can.
And that's what an eruv is and how it works. I have to admit, when we first put our eruv up, I was a bit sceptical as to how significant it would be and how much of an effect it would have on our community. But the word eruv, as we've said, means intermingling. And it's not just the domains that it intermingles, it helps the people as well come together
and people that would otherwise have restricted mobility and find it difficult to come out on Shabbos are now able to come to shul. And you have disabled people, the elderly and the infirm, that are able to get to shul where otherwise they couldn't within the confines of Shabbos. And it's had a wonderful effect on helping people with kids and buggies and so on, being able to get to shul and move out and about and get to each other, and that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. Thank you very much for watching, and Shabbat Shalom.